Go out and help someone is the best we can do. There's someone who needs someone to help.
Bobby Presley, who was professor at at Texas A&M University in the Department of Oceanography. And we're going to start with the real basics today, and he is going to present Pollution 101. Bobby is asking people to save their questions for the end, so you may want to take some notes because I'm sure everybody will have questions unless they remember their high school and college courses on pollution. So does anybody have any questions? All right, and here we go, Bobby.
Well, I would say you don't need to take any notes. If you're really interested, I can email you this Word document, which is the only graphic that I have. This is a Word document that I created about 30 years ago when I was teaching a pollution class to undergraduates at A&M. So I've added a few things to it. The original stuff that I retained is still applicable, but as I say, I've got a lot of stuff. I'm going to go through the first parts of it fairly quickly, and I can email it to anybody who's interested. So the first thing I'm saying here is that we acquire a lot of stuff, and most of it doesn't last very long. So we use it, and then we've got to get rid of it. It turns out that if we consider all the trains, planes, and automobiles and construction rubble and everything else, every man, woman, and child in the United States gets rid of about a ton of solid waste every month. In addition to that, we release about a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. Well, the solid waste especially has to go someplace, and it upsets people if you pile it up in your front yard. So what are we going to do with it? Ideally, we would recycle everything. And if you've got some old cowboy boots and an old guitar you're not using, you can probably take it down to Goodwill and somebody else would use it, which is great. Also, if you've got a bunch of old beer cans, you can take those to the recycle place. They will be melted down and made into new aluminum cans, which is less expensive than starting from scratch. That might be true of newspaper and cardboard, but I'm not sure of that. But almost anything else you can think of, we have to just dispose of. Well, if you lived on a river, you could just throw it in the river, or ocean, throw it in the ocean, but that causes problems. You could just burn it, which we used to do a lot of, but that causes problems. So we really don't like either of those options, which leaves us with landfills. So we haul the stuff out in the country someplace, crush it down, cover it up with dirt, plant some grass, and forget about it. And that actually works pretty well most of the time. Now, things we might be concerned with about the things that we're throwing away is their toxicity. How much of it is produced? If only a tiny amount is produced, we don't worry about it so much. And its persistence in the environment. And I'll just say a word or two more about this third item here, persistence. Industry over the last 20 years or so has worked hard to try to make things like plastics less persistent, make them degrade in the environment more quickly. And the best example of that is pesticides. You can find DDT almost anywhere you look that was used 50 years or more ago. But if you start looking for any of the pesticides that have been for sale over the last 20 years or so, you really have trouble finding them in the environment because they're designed to degrade very quickly and no longer be harmful. So thank you, industry, for that effort. They've also made efforts to reduce the amount of packaging and just make everything more lightweight, have a little bit less solid material going into landfills. Of course, again, with this material we're throwing away, we're concerned that it might harm human health or non-human parts of the ecosystem, or that might interfere with use of resources in some other way, like, dumping a bunch of old railroad cars in your swimming hole would cause a problem. And finally, then, we're concerned with things that affect the climate and weather. And that really is the biggest thing, but is not something I'm going to talk about today. But it is probably our biggest pollution, if you want to call it pollution problem, that we're adding all this CO2, as I said earlier, here in the US, equivalent to burning 100 gallons of gasoline for every man, woman, and child every month. And it is really affecting the climate, and it's going to have dire consequences if we don't do something about it. Now, another way to look at these things that we're throwing away is from the chemical standpoint, in which case we can divide them up into radioactive substances, petroleum and refined petroleum products, pesticides, other synthetic organics, plant nutrients, and then again our CO2. And finally, my favorite, metals like arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and whatnot. Now, I've been involved over the years in many large environmental monitoring programs where we went out into the environment and tried to determine the amount of these things that was there and how they're distributed and how they're behaving. Without exception, in my experience, when the university like Texas A&M gets a contract to do this kind of work, we bring in somebody to do each one of these different things. So it was always my job, for example, to do the metals, and somebody else would do these other things, because for each one of them, you need specialized instrumentation and specialized expertise to do it right. So we would get a big group together, we'd go out, we'd take the samples, we'd divide the samples up, we'd take them back to our laboratories, we analyze them. At the end of the project, you get all the data together, you hire a statistician, and you try to make some sense of it. We did that over and over again. Now, reducing the amount of these things is expensive. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But it's pretty obvious that some of these things are harmful to the environment. So the federal government, the Congress has passed various laws over the years to try to protect the environment and human health. One of the first ones was the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. And that was instigated because, especially in New York City, but in some of the other cities too, there was so much new construction going on, tearing down old buildings and just hauling all kinds of stuff, barging it out and dumping it out in the middle of the harbor, which was creating a navigation hazard. People weren't concerned about the toxicity, but you couldn't get your boat up to the boat dock. So they passed the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. So things went along for a while, and we started using more and more oil and gasoline and diesel and whatnot. And that stuff was getting into the rivers and into the harbors and causing just a big, stinking, dangerous mess. So we got the Oil Pollution Act of 1924. Again, things kind of went along, and we were polluting the environment, and people started becoming concerned. So the federal government passed what was called the Water Pollution Control Act in 1948. Now, the essence of this act was to give grants to the individual states and ask them to clean up the environment. In those days, people didn't want the federal government interfering in their life. There are still people like that. So in any case, the 1948 thing mainly relegated to the states the responsibility for keeping the environment clean. So we go along for a while, and we get the 1960s, and we get the hippies and the tree huggers, and they start complaining about the environment. So the Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969. This is a broad, overarching act that basically just set goals and stated the intent of the Congress. The Congress said it's our intent to make all the waters of the United States fishable and swimmable, for example. So it was mainly setting goals and saying what the intent was. So following that, then we start getting the individual laws that are going to do what is necessary to reach these goals. So we get the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Pesticide Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and others. I'm just kind of giving some of the main ones here. It's kind of interesting that all these things were passed during the Nixon administration, which I guess goes to show that the hippies and the tree huggers were loud enough to get things done. I'm not sure that would have influenced Trump, but it did influence Nixon. So we got all these environmental laws in the 70s. Things changed again a little bit here with my number 11 with the Resources Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, so-called RCRA. And at that point, it occurred to somebody, now, wait a minute, maybe we should make these people pay for the damages they are doing to the environment. And this was also the first time that there was much emphasis on solid waste. Up until that point, they're still going back to the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act to control solid waste. And most of these other things that I mentioned deal with air and water. So we bring in solid waste with RCRA, and we bring in the idea of natural resource damage and natural resource damage assessment. So some of us got contracts over the years to try to assess what damage has been done to the environment, and then the government would try to assign responsibility for this damage and recover funds for the damage it was done. You know, it says, well, you messed this up. We used to catch 1 million pounds of fish a year. Now we're only getting 500,000. So, you know, there's a 500,000 pounds of fish that damage you've done, or, you know, whatever. The other 76 law was, again, mostly just to give out grants for research and development, so it is not terribly relevant. But the real big one then came in 1980 with CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental, how did that go? Resource Reclamation and Liability Act, the so-called Superfund Act. And this really changed the game and really started holding people's feet to the fire as far as them damaging the environment, because this not only assessed fees for the damage, but fees for cleanup. And some of these things, some of these cleanups are incredibly expensive, just unbelievable, as I'll mention in a minute. But at this point, there are like 40,000 Superfund sites around the United States. And once a site is declared as a Superfund site, then NOAA is out, and the EPA, who oversees the Superfund site, takes precedent, and they press whatever actions they're going to take. But as I was saying, you know, some of these cleanups are just incredibly expensive. The one that I'm most familiar with is on the coast here in Texas, down in Lavaca Bay, down by Port Lavaca, Point Comfort. It was known for a long time that Alcoa was releasing mercury into that bay, and the state made some aborted attempts to do something about it, but really nothing much happened. So one guy had done a little bit of work down there, and then I found out about it, and my students and I started. Then NOAA came in and started an action under the natural resource damage portions of RCRA. And NOAA against Alcoa in court, it dragged on and on. But finally, Alcoa said, well, okay, we're going to put up $100 million to try to clean this mess up down here. Well, you know, $100 million, that's quite a little bit of money. But really, it wasn't nearly enough. And in fact, I think it made very little difference in the problem. The problem is so large, it's really intractable. The amount of mercury that was released, just crazy. Same thing happened at several other places around the country, by the way, with the mercury. But in any case, you think, well, $100 million, geez, that's a whole lot of money. And it is. But how about the nuclear site on the Columbia River up Hanford, Washington? They started trying to clean that up in 1989 and are still working on it and have spent about $100 billion. And it's still a complete mess up there, and they're still working on it. A similar one, federal government site, and you see the federal government has to adhere to these same rules and regulations as everybody else. And so do cities and states and counties and universities and individuals. But another big one is the Rocky Mountain Arsenal up in Colorado. And there are other big ones. I just picked out a couple that I could find something about on the internet. But Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is an Army proving ground up in Colorado where they were firing uranium munitions and doing various things. they've been trying to clean that one up for 30 years or so, and maybe have spent $10 billion or so. Or closer to home, we can think about when the Deepwater Horizon oil drilling platform blew up several years ago and made a complete mess. It's still a mess, and probably a couple of $1 billion have been spent to try to clean that up, and it's still a mess. Well, there are a number of others around the country that have also spent hundreds of millions of dollars, including some cities and some public utility districts and other entities like that. So, you know, we're talking about real money here. I note just by comparison that the budgets for most federal departments, you know, the Commerce Department, the Labor Department, the Education Department, you know, whatever departments there are 10 or 12. Most of those have budgets that are 10 or 20 or 30 billion dollars a year. Veterans Affairs has a bigger budget, like 100 billion. And of course, this is per year, where up here we're talking about, you know, expenditures over a period of years. But nevertheless, the point is that environmental cleanup is expensive. And that's without even considering pollution prevention. You know, all the equipment they put on factories to try to prevent pollution in the first place. We're talking about a lot of money here. And there's been a lot of talk then over the years about, well, is this money well spent or not? And that opens up a real can of worms that is certainly above my pay grade, because what you've got to consider, of course, in looking at any kind of a cost-benefit analysis, well, what is a human life worth? You know, what is it worth to add 1 day to a human life, or 1 week or 1 month? What is that worth? You know, what is it worth to make sure the blind salamander doesn't go extinct, or the golden cheek warbler, you know, or the California condor, or whatever? What are all these things worth, and are they worth the money we're spending to prevent pollution or to clean up pollution? You get into a real can of worms there. So switching gears a little bit, in addition to all these federal laws and state laws that I talked about, the U.S. has entered into many treaties and conventions with other countries, and these all have the force of federal law. Something to keep in mind. The other thing that may or may not be worth pointing out is these laws are not in themselves regulations. I mean, some of these laws may run dozens or hundreds of pages long, but they still do not have all the details in them as to what can and can't be done in order to either prevent pollution or to clean up pollution. The real nitty-gritty is found in what's called the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. And of course, the CFR is thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, because it goes into great detail on, you know, just exactly what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Now, certain federal agencies are authorized to make these regulations, which you find in the CFR. The main one, of course, is the Environmental Protection Agency, but there are a number of others like NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Coast Guard, Corps of Engineers, and so forth and so forth. Each one of these kind of has their own area of jurisdiction, but they overlap, and there's always some jockeying between these agencies as to who is responsible for what. But in general, it's fairly clear cut, and to some extent, the EPA has the final word on things. But the Army Corps of Engineers, as you might expect, have to give permission to dam up a stream or drain a wetland, or do anything that's going to be an engineering action that's going to change the environment. But what would normally happen is you as an individual, or Texas A&M as a university, or Bryan as a city, or whatever, you want to do something, whether it's dam up a stream or release wastewater into the stream or burn something that adds material to the air, or anything you want to do, you're going to have to apply to the Environmental Protection Agency for a permit. And depending on what it is you're trying to do, or what you want to do, the EPA then will say to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, well, how do you think this is going to affect the wildlife in the area? Do you have any concerns with this? And so Fish and Wildlife will come back and say, yeah, we got a lot of concerns here. Or, the National Park Service or whoever. So, everybody gets involved, or potentially gets involved, or gets a chance to get involved. And that really makes it complicated to do just about anything you want to do that would interfere physically with the environment, whether you're cutting down trees or draining a wetland or whatever, like I was talking about earlier, or, release some toxic substance into the environment or whatever. You've got to get a permit, and it's got to go through numerous agencies before you can get the permit. And that's what drives people crazy. And, what causes people to march on Washington or whatever. But this stuff has worked. These environmental laws and the resulting rules and regulations have worked. There is no doubt whatsoever that the environment is much cleaner now than it was back in the 50s and 60s before these laws were enacted. So, it's difficult for individuals, for cities, for everybody to comply with these environmental rules and regulations, but they work. And so I think we all should support them. I've got a few other things here, but nothing that you can't read on your own. I'm not sure whether it's worth going through any of this or not. I guess as I say, I can email this to anybody who wants it. I guess sort of following up on what I just said about the environment being cleaner now than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, it is really a problem to detect most pollutants in most environments. Sure, if you go to one of these Superfund sites, you don't need anybody who is very expert to determine what pollutants are there and how much. But if you go to some place, even a few hundred yards or a few miles, usually away from one of these point sources of pollution, the pollutants, whether it be metals or pesticides or petroleum hydrocarbons or plasticizers or whatever it happens to be, those things are in incredibly low concentrations, and you really need to know what you're doing to take the samples, get them transported back to the lab, get them prepared, and get them analyzed correctly, accurately, for whatever it is you're looking for. So my thought always when I see something in the newspaper about somebody finding some pollutant in the Bryan Municipal Lake or whatever it happens to be, is the first thing you should think is, well, that's probably wrong. Whoever made that measurement probably didn't know what they were doing, because just to repeat myself, the measurements away from point sources of pollution are difficult to make and require specialized instrumentation and specialized knowledge. And especially if you're talking about water, some of the other things, organic tissue, organisms tend to concentrate some of these pollutants, and it makes it easier to analyze the organism than it is to analyze something in the environment where you find the organism. So I don't know what else I can say. This is just kind of a quick and dirty, very brief introduction to what are pollutants, what do we do about it, and is it worth the cost? So I'll leave it there, and if anybody has questions, I'll try to answer them.
Go out and help someone is the best we can do. There's someone who needs someone to help.